When Bryson first set foot on his land in Georgetown, he believed he had found the kind of peace that only wide Texas skies and a little distance from the noise of the city could offer. He was wrong. The letters started slow, like the first drops of a storm, arriving one at a time in his mailbox. At first glance, they almost seemed laughable. A warning about the way his shed looked, a complaint about the gravel he'd poured for his driveway, even a notice claiming his porch light didn't meet community standards. The absurdity was obvious. Bryson's property wasn't part of their community at all. He hadn't signed their contracts, hadn't bought into their gated lifestyle. He lived on his own land, free and clear. But the HOA didn't see it that way. What began as petty grievances quickly escalated into calculated harassment. The tone of each new letter grew sharper, the fines larger. $50 became hundreds, hundreds turned into thousands, and before Bryson could catch his breath, the HOA claimed he owed $250,000. The letters weren't just paper, they were weapons, designed to grind him down piece by piece until he either bent to their will or broke under the weight. They accused, they threatened, and they carried the smug confidence of people who had played this game before and usually won. Neighbors whispered about him at community gatherings, pointing at him as the outsider who refused to follow rules, even though those rules had never applied to him in the first place. The board painted him as a selfish man, someone who would drag down property values and tarnish the perfect image they worked so hard to maintain. They weren't just trying to fine him, they were trying to isolate him, to make him the villain in his own neighborhood. But Bryson saw through it. He understood what they were doing, using intimidation as their tool, counting on fear and exhaustion to make him surrender. To the board, the fines weren't about sheds, lights, or driveways. They were about control. It was a slow, methodical abuse of power, carried out by people who believed they held the keys to the entire neighborhood and that no one would ever dare push back. Late one night, when the house was quiet and the only light came from the glow of his computer screen, Bryson spread old property records across his desk. For weeks, the HOA had been suffocating him with threats, each letter designed to tighten the noose, but he refused to believe there wasn't a way out. His fingers traced signatures, deeds, county filings, paper trails that most men would have tossed aside as meaningless. That's when he found it. Hidden in the layers of paperwork from a real estate deal years earlier was the detail that shifted the ground beneath everything through a holding company he controlled. Bryson owned the very soil on which the subdivision had been built. It was almost surreal. The million-dollar homes, the manicured lawns, the streets patrolled by watchful neighbors. All of it sat on land tied back to him. The board that had been drowning him in fines had no idea they had been standing on his property the entire time. For a moment, Bryson leaned back in his chair and let the irony wash over him. They believed they held power over him, but the truth was, he held the foundation of their world in his hands. The realization didn't come with fireworks or some dramatic outburst. It came with a smile, slow and sharp, the kind of smile a man makes when he sees a bully's bluff for what it is. Every final notice they had shoved into his mailbox suddenly looked like a bad joke. They thought they were kings of their gated empire, but the crown wasn't theirs. It never had been. Bryson knew this discovery wasn't the end of the fight, only the beginning. He also knew that knowledge was heavier than steel, and this piece of knowledge could break the board's grip. They wanted to believe he was powerless, a man out of place in their tidy vision of community. But the truth was darker and far more dangerous for them. The man they were trying to bury was the one who owned the ground beneath their feet. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and nerves. On one side sat the HOA board, dressed sharp, their backs stiff with the arrogance of people who had always been obeyed. Gregory Haskell wore his best suit, chin high as if the verdict was already written in his favor, while Elaine Drummond shuffled papers like a woman preparing to bury her enemy under the weight of documents. Their lawyer spoke with the rhythm of certainty, painting Bryson as a defiant neighbor who believed he was above the rules, a man who threatened the harmony of their perfect community. Every word dripped with the confidence of people who had never been told no. But when it was Bryson's turn, the air shifted. His lawyer, Renee Callahan, didn't raise her voice or perform theatrics. She simply laid down the truth with the weight of stone. One by one, she placed deeds and records before the judge, each paper a nail in the coffin of the HOA's authority. And then came the revelation that cracked the room open. Bryson wasn't just outside the HOA's reach. He owned the very ground beneath their subdivision. The gasps from the gallery weren't just noise. They were the sound of an entire neighborhood realizing the world they thought was stable had been built on sand. Gregory's face drained of color, his polished image slipping into something raw and desperate. Elaine's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering against the table louder than it should have. The judge leaned back, weighing the evidence, his words calm but cutting. The HOA's standing was in question. Their claim to authority suddenly looked like a castle made of smoke. The fallout spread like fire. Back in the neighborhood, neighbors who once whispered about Bresson as an outsider now whispered about the board as layers. Some felt betrayed, realizing the people they trusted with their community had dragged them into a war they couldn't win. Others grew frightened, their eyes darting at Bresson not as an enemy anymore, but as a man who could, if he chose, pull the rug from under their very homes. The unity the HOA had preached cracked down the middle. In the space of one courtroom session, the narrative flipped. The bully had been unmasked, and the board's polished authority was revealed as nothing more than overreach dressed in fine clothes. And Bryson, who had been painted as a stubborn neighbor, stood instead as proof that power only lasts as long as people believe in it. Bryson's victory wasn't just about winning a case. It was about tearing away the mask of authority and showing the raw face beneath it. For months, the HOA had carried itself like a government, issuing fines as if they were law, demanding obedience as if their word was final. Most people in the neighborhood accepted it because it was easier to comply than to question. That's how power works. It feeds on silence. But Bryson's refusal to bow exposed a truth many had forgotten: authority is only real if you give it permission to exist. When the court stripped the board of its standing, the cracks spread beyond the subdivision. Neighbors who once believed the board's word was gospel began asking questions they had never dared before. Why had they been paying dues without knowing where the money went? Why had they signed documents they never fully read? Why had they allowed strangers with titles like president or treasurer to dictate what color their doors should be or what flag they could fly? The revelation left a bitter taste in their mouths. The people they trusted to protect their community had been nothing more than gatekeepers drunk on borrowed power. For Bryson, the lesson was darker, sharper. He had seen firsthand how easily ordinary men and women could be convinced to act as oppressors when given a clipboard and a title. It wasn't the size of the fines that had nearly broken him. It was the arrogance behind them, the certainty that he would eventually submit. That kind of control wasn't unique to HOAs. It lived in workplaces, in governments, in every institution where people handed away their rights without a fight. Walking back onto his land after the trial, Bryson felt no triumph in the traditional sense. There were no cheers, no celebrations waiting for him. What lingered instead was a cold understanding. Freedom isn't something given. It's something defended, often against the very people who claim they're protecting you. The HOA thought they owned him, but in the end, they only revealed how fragile their authority truly was. And if there was one truth Bresson carried from the ashes of that battle, it was this: power, unchecked, will always try to consume you, until someone is willing to stand and remind it where the line is drawn.